Great.
That's good. Hi, everybody. This is great. Great to join. It's fun to see the names of the cities popping up on the side, to see where everybody is from in the chat. I'm Rachel Brahinsky. That was Alex Tarr. You'll hear from him again. He's waving. I'm not sure if you can see us both, but we're having lunch with you. That's what's going on today. I wanted to first thank John and Christine for the introduction, for inviting us to present to you today. I think John was one of the first people to email me when the book first was making sounds of coming out, and said, hey, please come give a talk to our people. So we're really happy that this came together and that we're here today. Let's see. I think this is the cover of our book. You'll see it again in a minute, but let's go to the next slide.
Yeah. So before we dive into our formal presentation, we just want to acknowledge that while Rachel and I wrote much of the book, and we've edited the entire manuscript many times now, we are very lucky to have entries written by Bay Area scholars who've done research and writing, contributing their expertise to the project. And then we had many other wonderful people support this work. In some cases, they contributed a single photo. In other cases, they helped connect us to people with images and more. So we thank all of them. And I will just briefly mention that most of the photographs you'll see today were taken by Bruce Reinhardt. So if they are archival or taken by another photographer, they will be labeled as such.
And I guess I should add, while we have this slide up, or it doesn't matter, actually, that's okay, Alex. He's controlling the slides, as you can tell, and we're gonna be going back and forth. He is in, where are you now?
Ohio.
You're in Ohio, and I'm in Oakland. And but Alex is a professor of geography at Worcester State in Massachusetts, and I'm a professor of geography and policy, excuse me, at USF in San Francisco. So that's, I think, all you need to know about us for now. You may sort of figure more out about where we come from as we talk. So I want to start by kind of orienting everyone to the kind of book that this is. It's a really unusual book. It's a hybrid of styles and ideas. And although it is a guide, it's an academic work. It's peer-reviewed, it's deeply researched. It's built through a series of more than 100 short essays about places, which typically use each place as a starting point for thinking about something larger. For example, the role of public space, or the legacy of a particular activist movement or ethnic group. So through the book, we're offering stories about places while also reaching for these kind of larger meanings, with an emphasis on social justice struggles and on the political and economic tensions that produce these struggles. So they're really short essays, but collectively they produce this larger narrative about the social and political geography of the Bay Area, how it has been produced and by whom, and that it's shaped like a guidebook. That's how I think of it. It's shaped like a guidebook. That means that it's written in a way that we hope will be accessible to a really broad public. And we'll tell you more about the structure of the book as the talk unfolds, and we'll show you some of the maps kind of in the middle of the talk. We wanted to start by reading selections, and again, we're gonna bounce back and forth between the two of us from the introduction, and that'll kind of set the scene, frame out some of the big ideas. And somewhere in the middle there, we're going to start scrolling through photos. Those are the ones that Alex just mentioned, by Bruce Reinhardt, and then archival photos and otherwise. And after we read from the introduction, we'll do a kind of a lightning round with a little bit of a dive into about 15 sites, about a minute or two sort of on each one, something like that. So I'll let Alex start by with the beginning of the intro.
Thank you, Rachel. So this, yes, this is from the introduction to the book. So you might begin in West Oakland, a place that reflects a remarkable spectrum of the Bay Area's culture and politics, its historical contradictions and challenges, and perhaps its hope for the future. Traverse these streets and you'll see Victorian cottages hand-built by workers in the late 19th century. You'll pass by community gardens where locals are claiming their right to urban space while remaking the meaning of urbanism. You'll maneuver streets where mid-century urban redevelopment tore through, devastating the neighborhood, and where people responded by building movements calling for self-determination and community control that echoed around the world. In wandering here, you'll inevitably intersect with the BART train tracks as they swoop from under the San Francisco Bay, shuttling thousands daily into San Francisco and out to the, quote, East County suburbs. In the distance, in the distance, you can probably see some of the cranes at the Port of Oakland, the Bay Area's stalwart economic gateway to the world. You may notice tent camps under the freeway overpasses or in the in-between places where uneven development has produced gaps in the urban fabric. Not far from where these houseless folks find shelter, you'll also see slickly painted homes with high-end cars and new fences. These are the now ubiquitous poles of the Bay Area's economic extremes, visible block to block. You can't see it today, but if you look down 7th Street from the San Francisco Bay a century ago, you would have been facing the last stop on the first transcontinental railroad. That train looms large and narratives of the conquest of the West and the fortunes that it brought to the rapacious capitalists known as the Big Four, Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, and Crocker, the core investors and figureheads of the Central Pacific Railroad. Ultimately, however, the majority of the people that these trains carried to the Bay Area, Chinese, Black, and working class whites, represented a very different narrative about this place. Here in West Oakland, for example, you'll be treading the same ground walked by African-American employees of the Pullman Company, who in the 1920s organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It was the first Black-run union chartered by the AFL-CIO and a bedrock in the development of neighborhoods like this one. Its presence on these streets helped create the historical possibility for social justice movements years later, like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and the contemporary movement for Black Lives. This historical legacy still lives in these streets. It is part of why these blocks hold places where anti-foreclosure activism has had some success, with residents banding together to save each other's homes from predatory bank actions, building community organizations for broader resilience along the way.
And I'll just answer a question I see in the chat. The images aren't scrolling yet, so you are only supposed to see the cover for the moment. Soon it'll change. So there are older histories here that can be even harder to see, but they too shape the everyday life of this neighborhood and the broader city. Before the age of conquest carved its urban patterns into the land, Native American tribes that thrived here for thousands of years knew it as Huichin, among other names, many that we probably will never know. At least one of the dozens of sacred shell mounds that circled the bay was here, near the water's edge, and here still is West Oakland. Though most visual evidence of this and other shell mounds has been buried by settler colonial urbanization, Native activists and allies continue to fight for recognition and respect for these sites. So we start the book in West Oakland, not because it's hip or transit accessible to San Francisco, as the boosters will tell you. Instead, we begin here because in many ways, this is one of the historic centers for so much of what we think of as San Francisco. From the activism mentioned already to the urban renewal that crisscrossed the neighborhood with freeways, from Victorian visuals to the colorful muralized storytelling that seems to grow each year. West Oakland reflects diverse narratives of connection across the region. So it's a good place from which to ask one of the questions at the heart of this book. How and why did the Bay Area come to be what it is now? So Oakland sits at the geographic center of this book, but the life of this city is only one piece of the larger story that A People's Guide to the San Francisco Bay Area tells about people and place. And now you can see photos scrolling and they'll just kind of roll past you as I keep reading. From our starting point in West Oakland, the Bay region spirals in all directions. And our book takes you from residential neighborhoods to tech campuses, from office towers to redwood forests and beyond. Through 5 chapters organized geographically, we've got the East Bay, South Bay and Peninsula, San Francisco, North Bay and islands, and 1 chapter that's designed around thematic tours. The book has 4 main aims. So first, we investigate the ways the Bay Area has been made through the efforts of people who lived, struggled, and thrived here. This is a special place where communities have challenged the abuse of power and built their own kinds of strength, generating wide webs of activism and humane creativity that continues to produce life-giving ideas. 2, we argue for the Bay Area to be understood not as San Francisco and its surroundings, but as an integrated region where over time, communities intersect and shape each other, they challenge each other, they forge the networks of power and identity that give shape to this place. More broadly, 3rd point here, this book is a guide to using a geographic lens on a place to understand its history and social movements. So we argue that through seeing and learning about spatial patterns and the situated histories of people, you can better understand how the Bay Area or any place came to be and how social struggles produced and continue to produce places like this. Finally, fourth point, this book asks you to put the book down and wander on your own. So we want to show you some of the things that we see and how we understand them. And we also hope you'll find your own path through these places and others with the tools that we share.
So one of our goals as we worked on this book was to embrace what scholar Catherine McKittrick describes as, quote, the geographical imperative in the struggle for social justice, end quote. That is, we wanted to look at the role of place and geography in understanding the bounds of justice. And we wanted to better understand how communities have reshaped those boundaries over time. Literary legend Toni Morrison writes about this sort of work through the metaphor of mapping. As she puts it, quote, I want to draw a map, so to speak, of a critical geography and use that map to open as much space for discovery, intellectual adventure, and close exploration as to the original chartering of the New World, without the mandate of conquest, end quote. This approach has driven our research and work in the Bay Area People's Guide. So we wrote this book over the course of many years, and then at times so much of the world seemed to change and continues to seem to be changing. We began writing in the ambivalent afterglow of the Occupy movement, and we completed most of it during and were influenced by the dual arrival of the Black Lives Matter movement and the now widespread anti-gentrification political work that is centered around evictions and housing. We completed the text amid the global rise of authoritarianism and the radical white supremacist right, and saw the most dramatic impacts of climate change to date. So much so that the term climate change began to morph into climate emergency, just as we sent out our edit for final text. The movement of that crisis was so rapid that we expect there to be new words and new terrible milestones, deadliest fires, biggest floods, hottest summers, hottest winters, before this book even makes it into people's hands. And unfortunately, it seems when we wrote that, we turned out to be right. So in the same period in California, we saw the birth and expansion of the app-fueled gig economy, which was just a small techno dream when we began to write, but by this book's end, Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, and the like had transformed communities around the globe, accelerating the visibility of the economic instability that was already on the rise. And for those of you in California, this obviously was a major political issue this year. More generally, economic inequality fueled huge changes in the landscape, and in many places and people that have formed our idea of the Bay Area have actually disappeared, pushed out by rising rents, demolitions, and a fraying social safety net. As we finished writing, the horrors of US detention camps for migrant children grew in scale. Sometimes these events made it hard to focus on writing. We wondered, does this book matter in the midst of so much inhumanity and crisis?
But as we worked on these essays, we continually rediscovered connections between the stories of the difficult past with our knowledge of the difficult present. And we were reminded that the relationships between oppression and activism are not chance meetings. As geographer and prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes, I'm quoting now, we simultaneously make places, things, and selves, although not under conditions of our own choosing. If agency is the human ability to craft opportunity from the wherewithal of everyday life, then agency and structure are products of each other. Without their mutual interaction, there would be no drama, no dynamic, no story to tell. Indeed, as we argue throughout the book, the Bay Area is a place with deeply entrenched injustices, racism, economic violence, homophobia. This means that the work of understanding what has come before and how people have survived, fought back, reimagined, and dreamed is essential here and beyond here. What this book shows is that from San Jose to Oakland to Petaluma, people continue to seek and strategize for a better world. These people persist, they are creative, sometimes they're victorious. When they get tired, there must be others to step in and take the baton. So we hope that this book can contribute a small part to sustaining communities engaged in these struggles, offering lessons about the enduring realities of oppression, alongside true stories of the geographies of hope and activism that offer necessary inspiration. As we closed out our work on A People's Guide to the Bay Area in the summer of 2019, we came back to the idea that investigations into this two-way relationship between people and place, people and place that is, that relationship matters deeply for dreaming a new future. In his novel on Native American Oakland, Tommy Orange writes that this may be the very thing that saves communities in enduringly challenging times. He writes, for example, that the mid-20th century government relocation of young Native Americans to cities was an attempt to eliminate Native culture. But instead, in the hands of his community, he observed that a forced migration was ultimately transformed as people forged new possibilities out of the ashes of the past. Even through dark times, as he put it, and this is a quote here, "The city made us new and we made it ours." And that's the end of the excerpt that we're going to read.
So our book is actually part of a series from UC Press being published as People's Guides to US Cities. So geographers Lara Polito, Laura Barraclough, and Wendy Chang published A People's Guide to Los Angeles in 2012. People's Guide to Greater Boston came out in June of 2020, this year. The New York City Guide is forthcoming soon. And as you can see on the screen, there's a number of other projects in the works. So the point here is just that we are part of a much larger project than just the San Francisco Bay. And this is from a website that's being developed to host many of these projects. So we want to share a couple of examples. Sorry, did I just skip ahead of myself? Yeah, okay, excuse me. So next we want to share a couple of examples from the sites of the book. So these maps will give you a sense of the scope of the sites that we cover. So the book is developed into 4 main chapters, and you'll sort of see as we go through examples what those actually look like. And what I want to do, and I apologize to those of you who are not familiar with the Bay Area, this is going to go by a little quickly, but on the left is a list of the sites for each chapter. We're not going to go through all of them, as Rachel mentioned, but you'll have to buy the book if you want to see the whole thing. In the middle image, what you're seeing is the overall map for that chapter, giving you a sense of the sort of unevenness of geography in the Bay Area. And then the image on the right is a map that's zoomed in on places where the sites are more dense, usually around the sort of urban core of each chapter. So this is the East Bay. And then we have a chapter on the South Bay. And one of the most interesting things in this project was having many arguments with friends and colleagues about where the South Bay stopped and start. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, about sort of how that line changes over time. And then despite our attempts to decenter San Francisco, it is very much a major part of the book. And many of the, I think, most compelling sites are there. So there are many around. And then finally, chapter 4, which is the North Bay and Islands. And this was really about sort of bringing the entire region together. And some of my favorite sites, I did a lot of the research for this part of the book, are throughout the North Bay and Islands, and I'll talk about some of those a little bit later this afternoon.
And the final chapter of the book is a thematic tour chapter, and we wanted to just show you 2 of the tours to give you a sense of what that chapter does. These tours are, as for those of you who do know the Bay Area, you can see that the distance covered between these various dots is quite large. And so to actually do one of these tours in a day would be, perhaps, it'd be a big undertaking. We'd love, I hope someone does it and tells us about it. But the bigger point of this chapter is really to draw out the themes. So we have here youth in revolt. There's a lot of, we touch a lot on the role of young people in stirring up activism in the region. And the other one is the Intertribal Bay, where we talk about sites of both historic and contemporary Native American life. And that was really important to us to draw that kind of line across history through and to now, and to hold up the reality of contemporary Native American life in our cities today. And so the tours, give you a sense of themes. They're sort of a quick pass through the region, but also in some cases offer you organizations that relate to the themes of the tours that you might visit or get to know. There's so many more that we could have included. And so it's just kind of a sampling, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of tours that you could also create for yourself in the book. And so the next section of this talk is getting into some of these sites. And so Alex will go first, and we're doing, I kind of think of it as a lightning round, about a minute, maybe 2 minutes on each of about 15 sites total. I guess it's 14. Alex will go first.
All right. get our slides going here. So I thought I'd start with the San Rafael Mission. This is one of the last missions built in the mission system. And for us, it's an important place to understand three sort of interconnected ideas about the book. So the first is that settler colonialism has structured life in the Bay Area for 2.5 centuries. And under Spanish rule is explicitly a genocidal project. Indeed, this mission was built mostly as a hospital to keep alive laborers who were dying at horrifying rates in the other missions. But at the same time, there's always been resistance and rebellion to those forces. So we discuss here the 1829 Miwok Rebellion that repeatedly drove Spanish troops back from here to the Presidio. So second, this site was a useful place to try and wrap one's head around the post-conquest history of the Bay, which is, and this has been making my head spin for years now, that history is actually quite short. So if you think about the Spanish arrive in the 1770s, and less than 75 years later, the region has gone from being conquered by the Spanish to being Mexico, briefly the California Republic, and then becoming a US state at the center of the gold rush. So that's less than a generation, or a lifespan, I should say. And then third, it's an important place to think about how myth-making happens. So we discuss here is the landscape you see is largely reproduced in the early 20th century by an Irish Catholic priest to sort of help bolster the Romantic mission history with support of the Hearst family. So it's a real kind of California myth-making place as much as it is a real historical landscape. The second site I want to talk about is down actually in Oakland, so spinning around the Bay a little bit. And this is the Intertribal Friendship House, which our dear collaborator, Diana Negrin, contributed to the site. And it provides an important parallel to the mission sites and understanding the Bay Area has a long-standing Native American, it's a site of understanding the Native American life from pre-conquest through the contemporary moment. So the Intertribal Friendship House was actually founded in 1955 by members of several different tribes, many of whom had actually been coerced by various means by the federal government to relocate to the Bay Area with the government's intention that they would assimilate into Anglo culture. Instead, members came together to build an important urban Native identity, which connects to deeper histories, but also radical movements in the 1970s and contemporary sites of reclaiming indigenous spaces, such as the Sogorea-Te Land Trust. Throughout the book, we want to hold together that what all these places show is history is not a linear progression necessarily, but a sedimentation of meanings and place, made and remade through peoples and the stories they keep about those places. And Rachel's quote from Tommy Orange, I think, captures some of that earlier. So we talk about a lot of very heavy things in the book, but we also, my slides move. We like to tell stories about radical cultural movements in the Bay Area, but we often talk about those cultural movements as discrete moments, but they're these amazing and sort of fascinating places around the Bay Area where these radical moments come together. So at the farm, here we have the legacy of the diggers, so the sort of radical food activists. It was an art performance space and an alternative schooling. And then in the 1970s, it simultaneously became a gathering spot for the Bay Area punk movement. And if you know punks, geography is sort of everything. Where they would do things in the farm, besides grow food and play music, they were doing things like raising funds for peace activists. And it was a real kind of place where countercultures came together and informed and shaped each other. Though, like much of the Bay Area radical culture, the sort of 1980s yuppification scattered those communities apart when the land of the farm was actually sold out from under them. This is one of my favorite sites in the book, and I tend to talk too long about it, so I'll try to keep this brief. So this is the NUMI plant, which if you look carefully, you'll see now says Tesla on it, and I'll explain why in a moment. So this is in Fremont, California, on the other side of the bay. So the new United Motors Manufacturing Incorporated, NUMI, plant opened at this site in 1984 as a joint project of General Motors and Toyota, with the promise of a new era of regularized and efficient car manufacturing. When Toyota officially closed the plant in 2009, it was the last union car plant on the West Coast. But the story is bookended at one end by how GM, so General Motors, suburbanized their production in the 1960s. So they'd actually operated a factory here for decades. when they moved here in the 60s, it cost Oakland and Black workers in the city high-wage jobs. At the other end of the story we tell is Tesla, who, despite their sort of high-tech centric sales pitch, they run one of the least automated plants in the world. It turns out making cars is harder than writing apps. And they have record high injury rates and wages that are fractions of UAW-backed labor agreements. So a century of labor geography can really be understood from this one particular site. And it's hard to miss if you're in the neighborhood. We also, moving our way further down into the bay, this is in Alviso, which is the sort of northern tip of San Jose. We talk a lot in the book about sites that are not so visible. So this site has stunning views. It's a favorite place to visit and sort of feel the sentiment and histories of the region. At the same time, it's a remarkable place to see how the vernacular landscape, the everyday landscape, like this bridge, does not always reveal the radical histories that take place here, such as the moment where Chicano activists set up their own toll booth as part of a campaign to demand that the street be paved in 1973. So we tell the story here of how this place went from a Santa Clara boomtown to an underdeveloped enclave that is now really being threatened by the long march of tech-generated wealth across the region. So sailing back up to the other end of the bay, I want to talk about sort of two more sites here. And many of you who are in the bay maybe have been here. It's a beloved site. So this is China Camp. At the end of the 19th century, Chinese immigrants, as I think many of you know, face extraordinary violence at the hand of white Californians. And this small bayfront stretch of land was one of about 24 villages where Chinese migrants were able to claim space and make a living gathering shrimp from the bay. In the book, we relate not just how white supremacy attempted to destroy the Chinese shrimping industry, but some of the ecological questions. So ultimately, the industry was really done in by the alteration of the Sacramento River Delta that shifted the Bay Area salinity so severely that the shrimp population left. There's also some stuff about pollution, or well, not fun stuff, but a history of pollution in the Bay that affects the story. But also the less than obvious global connections. So most of the shrimp collected here were actually dried and sold through Chinese organizations to other Chinese communities around the world. So what interested us most in this site is how it becomes a beloved state park, but is also really used in the present to make important political claims for recognition by Chinese and Chinese American communities. And so it's really an interesting story of preservation as a sort of political justice act. And then the last site I'll touch on today is the Golden Gate Village. So these striking buildings were designed by Aaron Green's firm, which was sort of the West Coast branch of Frank Lloyd Wright, and then the famed landscape architect Lawrence Halprin, using FHA money. So we normally associate FHA money with white flight to the suburbs. And they built this housing for predominantly Black migrant workers who had come to Marin during World War II to help build the ships that won the war. So behind the public housing are vast open spaces, and in front you get these amazing bay views. So even though Marin is increasingly wealthy and white, and these projects are in dire need of millions of dollars of repair, the residents who have called this place home for decades actually worked with architectural historians to save the buildings through the National Historic Registry. So part of why I want to end my part with these buildings is I think they really hold the promise for a different type of Bay Area, and especially the North Bay, where you have a more inclusive, racially just, democratic place that's captured and built into the landscape itself. So with that, I will stop talking too quickly and hand it over to Rachel.
Thank you. So the next spot, let's see, oh good, I thought I was muted. This is the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park, and you'll recognize this image from that first slide. This is on the cover of the book, so you can look for that when you're out in bookstores. I was about to say, nobody's out in bookstores very much these days, but go to your local bookstores anyway. Anyway, so the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park. So we use the entry about this park, which is actually right next to the port. What you're looking at is the Port of Oakland. And we use the entry about the park to think about the role of ports in general, and this port specifically, and the rise of the region and as well as the rise of the power of labor, which has grown in part through the realization that closing down this port has a massive effect across the economy. We also tell the story of the Occupy movement's takeover of the port that was back in December 2011, and we introduce readers to the presence of the park itself, which you can see there now. And this park, I love it. It offers a kind of a terrific underappreciated view of San Francisco in one direction, and then the operations of the port, which you were just looking at in the other direction. And there's a tower that you can climb that kind of gives you a good view. And there's a beach, I believe the only beach in Oakland. The next site I'm going to talk about takes you to the sort of secretive landscape of the internet. So this is room 641A in San Francisco. As you can see, it's near the corner of Folsom and 2nd Streets. This is a room in the AT&T building on Folsom Street. It was revealed some years back as a secret surveillance node where our digitized information is routed and can be read. And this is all done with the blessing of Congress, so not so secret anymore. Bruce Reinhardt researched this one, and we use the entry to tell you about the ways that your data is being captured and watched. But we also use the entry to talk about the open source software movement. So we look at the ways that tech is not always about top-down power, but we argue here that to find the bottom-up tech, you need to look a little farther than the apps that claim to democratize our lives with ride-hailing and things like this. So this piece also makes the very important point that this is one of the many places of the supposedly placeless internet. And the Bay Area has lots of those, though they are often unrecognized or essentially invisible. Totally different topic, bouncing back to the East Bay. This is the 1500 block of Adeline. And the entry here opens up the door for a discussion of the impact of foreclosures and the 2008 crash on Bay Area cities, which was actually quite brutal, especially in the East Bay, not as brutal in San Francisco, but in the East Bay, it really took a toll. And this entry specifically focuses on a story of reclaiming a home that was threatened by bank foreclosure. It was researched by Katja Schwaller, and she writes about the success of that action, but also about the legacy and succession of community work in Oakland. So this is the same neighborhood that we were describing at the very beginning of the talk, where the Pullman Porters were based, where the Black Panther Party centered its Oakland organizing, and much more. Now, since this action around foreclosure, it also happens to be the same neighborhood just a few blocks away that was in the news last year with the Moms for Housing occupation. So another example of the power of direct action organizing to save working class homes, for some reason happening over and over in this same place. Next site I'm going to talk about is back in San Francisco on Bernal Hill. This is Alex Nieto Park. And the starting point for this entry is the horrific killing by San Francisco police of a Latinx man, Alex Nieto, while he was sitting on a park bench eating a burrito. I don't need to repeat the horrible details of the killing here, but they're in the entry, which was written by Lisa Ruth Elliott. And the entry uses the community intervention of creating a memorial for Nieto to think about the twin and not unrelated histories of left activism and Latinx migration into the Mission District. So you learn about this place that's sometimes called Red Hill for at least 2 reasons, and its broader role in the Mission District, which tells you something about why community members developed a steady campaign to pursue the truth about Nieto's killing, and then push the city to create an official memorial. That's coming soon. This picture here is of one of the many temporary memorials that has been made and remade several times, but there is an official one coming soon that was approved, I think about a year ago now, if not a little bit longer, by the City Board of Supervisors. So staying in San Francisco and still thinking about power, this is the Civic Center, and I think the site is actually Civic Center and UN Plaza. You know, civic centers represent urban power, and studying their development and use can tell you a lot about the fundamental values of a city. And whereas a kind of typical guide might focus on the very beautiful classical architecture here, the museums, which are wonderful, or maybe the politics, the mayor, things like this. Instead, we focus in this entry on the people who seek shelter in these plazas. So the crisis of homelessness continues to grow in the Bay Area, and we focus here on both the history of this challenge in San Francisco and more broadly, and on the ways that advocates use this central civic space to challenge city leaders to tackle the problem in new ways. So the place itself is really important. By chance, this site is also not far from the hotels that advocates have been arguing should be reclaimed permanently as long-term shelter during the COVID crisis. That fight is still underway and very much in the news actually this morning and yesterday, this week. But we can talk about that later. Now I want to talk about the Francis Albright Community Center in the East Bay. This is a site that is centered around the life and work of Francis Albright, but it's also about the neighborhood in which she was central. So this was written and researched by Donna Graves, who's a wonderful community historian, and she tells the story of Albright's migration to South Berkeley from Alabama and the racial and gender barriers that she continually broke through. The key here, though, is that she was part of this larger community network, and the barriers that she busted open were not self-serving, but were community-minded. She was the first African-American woman to run for city council in Berkeley in 1939. She didn't win, but she was also, and more successfully, the first Black woman welder at the Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond. And in demanding her rightful place for this position, for which she was highly qualified but had been denied, she opened up a space for a generation of Black women. And these are just a couple of her accomplishments. There's so much more, actually, and you can see a hint of it in the pictures here with the sign that says, "Don't buy where you can't work." She was a part of this campaign around labor discrimination in the neighborhood. The entry, though, also gives us a chance to talk about the diverse cultural creativity of South Berkeley, which is where this is. And it's long been home to a multi-ethnic community, Black, white, Japanese American, many other people. This community had a very kind of special vibe. And so we get into some of that and how special it was, particularly during an age, you know, in the late 30s, 1940s, 1950s, in which segregation was still strong and racial tensions really ruled the day in many places, as they unfortunately do again today. One more site for me, this is the Pacific Center front steps. So we're this is in the East Bay, we're in Berkeley here, and we're very far from the tourist heavy Castro district in San Francisco, but here's where you find the Pacific Center, which happens to be the Bay Area's oldest LGBTQ center. It's founded in 1973. And there are really important stories to be told about the center itself and the historical role of the queer East Bay. And indeed, this kind of area is interesting. Not far away is the White Horse Inn, which is right by these rainbow crosswalks on 66th and Telegraph. That bar has been operational as a gay and lesbian bar since at least 1933. So this history runs deep, but that's not what this entry is about. In this entry, we focus on just one event that took place on the steps of the center, which was researched by Barnali Ghosh and Anirvan Chatterjee, who are the story scholars, as I think of them, at the Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour. So they tell this story as part of their monthly tours. I think it's not quite monthly during COVID, but normally it is. This photo shows them gathering for one of their walks some years ago. And what they tell is the story of these steps, back to the steps. It was here on these steps in 1986 that Bangladeshi American Berkeley resident Tinku Ali Ashtiak stumbled upon a black and white flyer that posed a very simple question, something like, "Are you South Asian and gay? Call Arvind." So Tinku had recently moved to the area from Bangladesh via Boston, where he'd studied computer engineering at MIT. He called the number, goes to San Jose, and meets this man, Arvind Kumar. At a time when coming out of as gay could have been deeply stigmatized and personally very, very risky, the two South Asian gay techies had a lot to discuss. And Ishtiaq would later, this is Tinku, would later go on to be one of the earliest members of Tricone, which is believed to have been the first formal South Asian or Desi LGBT identified organization in the entire world. All started on these steps. So the organization kind of came out organizationally that year by marching in the Pride Parade in San Francisco, which at that time was still called the International Lesbian and Gay Freedom Day Parade. And they grew from there. And with a base in the Bay Area, the network and newsletter, which had echoes of the Gutter movement of the 1910s, that's another site in the book, it's in the San Francisco chapter. This network became an organizing tool across the US and internationally, connecting LGBTQ people across the South Asian diaspora. And as a side note, the organizers of this walking tour just this year succeeded in winning the renaming of a piece of Shattuck Avenue for a woman named Kala Bagai. The street sign is not up yet. This is a fresh victory, but this will be the only street in the city of Berkeley named after an Asian American, although Asian Americans represent 20% of the population of Berkeley. So that's our last site for today. And I just want to kind of wrap up by saying there are many takeaways from this book. As you can see, we touch on a wide variety of topics, but at the core, what we're arguing is that the ongoing study of the relationship between places and people can teach you a lot about where you are, who we are collectively, and how to move through difficult times like the ones that we're experiencing right now. And so with that, thank you for listening and for your interest in the book. We have some time for questions. I think John has noted in the side that you can ask them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can use the Q&A box. So there are many ways to ask your questions, and we're here to help.
Thank you
Great,
both.
thanks so much, Rachel. We had a very active discussion in the chat about, well, first, thank you. That was an amazing presentation and so many wonderful places that you've talked about. But we had a very active discussion about American graffiti. Of course, people love to engage. Where exactly was it filmed? So I checked the Internet Movie Database, IMDb, which basically shows it's filmed everywhere. So it is filmed in Petaluma, Marin, San Rafael, Mill Valley, San Francisco. They definitely utilized a lot of local locations.
Yeah,
so John, did you have any questions that we could
I
start
do.
with?
I'll keep an eye on the chat box here. The first question coming from people is where they can find the book. Besides, they're saying besides Amazon, of course.
Yeah, you know, it's sort of sold everywhere. I'm going to type my website into the chat, which is where you can get a code for a discount through the UC Press website to buy the book. And on that website, there's a drop-down menu for buying the book, and you can either do it directly from UC Press, or they give you options, and there's a bunch of independent booksellers through those options that you can choose. So they also have Amazon in the list, so you have all sorts of choices, but there are lots of ways to avoid Amazon if you want to. I'll type it in right now.
Thanks. And it looks like somebody said City Lights Bookstore in San Francisco has 3 copies in stock. Local legacy business in San Francisco, actually. So go City Lights. And it looks like Rachel pasted the website. So if you'd like to visit that, you can purchase the book there. Maybe I'll kick it off with a question from me really about many of the places you featured did in fact have a lot of built sort of environments that sort of were involved in the history of the site. But some of them were also sites that had no sort of tangible sort of indication of what happened at that place. And I'm wondering how that plays into your book, and how do these sites, I guess my question really is, how do we as historic preservationists and people really interested in public history and getting people involved and interested in the past of a place, when you lack a tangible reminder of what happened there, it makes it a bit more difficult to tell that story. And how did you grapple with that question with your book?
I think, Alex, did you want to take it? Or
why don't you start? Because I'm going to start talking about
Okay.
Walgreens. So
okay.
there was a moment where we were working the book. I was like, all of my sites seem to have been torn down and turned into Walgreens.
This is one of the problems. I mean, it's definitely, you know, I think we felt that challenge in a variety of ways. We wanted to, on the one hand, write about places that haven't been recognized, right? Because this, you know, the write-up in our book then becomes one of the memorials to it. It also becomes a way to, produce a memorial if someone wants to do that later, right? So I think one example of that we showed is the Alex Nieto Park, which is not officially named Alex Nieto Park. I think it's Bernal Heights Park is the name of it. And the park isn't being renamed after Nieto, but community members have organized and continue to organize to create awareness. And over, it's many years now, I think it took 5 years to get, maybe it's 4 years to get the memorial approved. It's still not built. Soon it will be. So there's this period of time, I think, before anything that is memorialized, before the memorialization happens of anything. I'm sorry, I'm distracted by the chat, and I shouldn't even look. I'm going to not look at the chat while I'm talking. I think, you know, I think that's one of the struggles. And I hope that perhaps some of what we write about will end up helping people produce public recognition for certain places that haven't really been recognized, or maybe expand and improve on recognition. Because also the other thing that we do is sometimes kind of look at places that are recognized in one way and say, well, there's another story that you really need to know about. And that's important too. And it may never get written formally on a plaque, but here it is in our book.
And, I'll briefly add, I think as we were sort of selecting the sites, we had, there's an infinite number of places in the Bay. And Rachel and I both sort of come from a cultural landscape studies tradition as part of our training. And sort of, we could probably write a book where every corner in Oakland was like what was included and tell a story there. So part of the idea is to sort of encourage people to look and ask why certain places have meaning to particular groups, and think about how certain sites can actually have multiple meanings. And I think maybe in the presentation we didn't cover them as much, but there's actually a fair number of sites that are still existing, but are not memorialized or not preserved. So I'm thinking about places like the Boyer home in San Jose, which was sort of a real center of early 19th century Black activism, which is just, a residential home, and it's a nice home in San Jose now, but, there's no plaque. As far as I know, there's no intention of preserving it, other than it's, now in a fairly nice neighborhood. But there's a lot of those types of things. So I think part of what we're interested in the book is, as Rachel said, encouraging readers to think about what are the places around them that maybe are not being recognized for their contributions, and that are important places for telling the types of stories that don't get told as often as maybe they should.
Great. And you had mentioned that some of the sites have been turned into Walgreens. One question that we got from Terry was, how many years did that book project actually take you to complete?
3 or 4 weeks. It's a complicated question, actually. I think maybe officially I would say 4 years, 5 years, from the real time that we started the research in earnest to it like hitting bookshelves.
But I mean, we began to think about it and conceptualize it back in 2012, but we also both work full-time as professors and are both working on other books and many other articles. And so this was so the project stretched over a long period of time, but as Alex is saying, I think it's more accurate to say that it really took, a few years to do, but those years were spread out over a longer period of time than just those years.
And I will say, when we sort of wrote our proposal for the press to do the book, and maybe I won't speak for Rachel, but my sort of impression is, these entries are fairly short, they're sort of sweet, and how long could it possibly take? And then subsequently realized we sort of signed up to do about 110 thorough research projects. And it was a lot of fun, really interesting to sort of dive into the archives and interview people and sort of pull on threads. But it really, and we pulled on a lot of threads that didn't go anywhere. One of the sites that I really wish had ended up in the book is about these South Asian anarchists living in the Oakland Hills, and just for the life of me could not track down where the building was. But there was this Bakunin Center in Oakland. So there's a lot of things like that that sort of slow down the process, because it's also potentially worth including.
So we've had a number of people, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry, John, I just was going to add one thing, which is I noticed in the chat someone else asked something about if there were challenges in connecting with locals. And I wanted to add, there's one other element of the book that we haven't shared with you, which is throughout the book, we have these fairly long quotes. They're set up as sidebars to the entries that are directly from interviews that we did. And so you get to hear directly from people who either participated in the things that we've written about, or who are historians regarding the things that we've written about, but it is these kind of first-person narratives, and they're a really important piece of it. Like, a first-person story from someone who personally squatted living across the street from 924 Gilman, which is this music venue that we write about in Berkeley. And she talks about the meaning of the landscape, why this industrial area was a place where she could stay as someone without a lot of means, and then what that meant for community building and the development of this place. And so we have a lot of this first person stuff that's threaded throughout that we haven't shared with you today, but it's there.
Great, thank you for mentioning that. I was about to ask that, but I'm glad you answered it. There were a number of questions. First of all, it looks like somebody that's related to you, perhaps a cousin, messaged you, and I won't read the whole thing because it was a private message, but I just wanted to point it out to you, Rachel, and have you reach out to her if you'd like. But
Thank you,
anyways,
thank you.
Right, and maybe there's somebody related to Alex here too, I don't know.
No, that's her. It's a long story. Sorry.
There were a lot of questions about specific sites, and I'm going to try to roll these all into one question here. Somebody was asking about Alcatraz, whether it was in the book. And then somebody was also asking
Yes.
about New Almaden, which you briefly mentioned, but they wanted to know what kind of, maybe if you could expand on that and tell us a little more about what you focused on with that feature.
Oh, New Almaden. So yes, Alcatraz is in the book, and we talk about it, I think in ways that anybody sort of knows Bay Area activist history would not be surprised by, about the American Indian movement, but also the long history of Alcatraz as a federal prison for incarcerating indigenous activists from around the country. So it has a sort of complicated history with sort of 19th century colonialism in the US. New Almaden, I think we tried to tell way too many stories there, but really looking at so for those of you who don't know, New Almaden was a mercury mine at the very sort of south end of San Jose. And the sort of industrial mining of gold requires a huge amount of mercury. So gold mining is not really possible without mercury. So people who control mercury mines actually turn out to be very, very powerful and very, very wealthy. So we talk a little bit about sort of the power struggles globally with British capital, and at one point Abraham Lincoln sends troops to protect the mine. But really what we use the site to talk about are how racial hierarchies are formed in the labor force in the Bay Area, and how the mine owners bring in Mexican workers and Cornish workers and Swedish workers, and sort of assign people of color to the most dangerous and toxic jobs, but also use the sort of racial hierarchies they establish to sort of upend any sort of labor organizing. And then the sort of toxic legacies and how it becomes a park and waste management facility, but also kind of a romantic part of the California gold history now.
And that's a theme that comes up, that last theme of this sort of tension between landscapes that we have poisoned, that are now landscapes that we use for recreation. And that comes up a lot across the book, and not just recreation, but also places where we live. And so just looking at just this ongoing, it really, I guess tension is really just the right word, so I'll keep using it over and over, but that, you know, the tension between the kind of need to develop, the need to have industry, the need to grow and expand, and also the ways that those practices have created toxic legacies that we live with, whether we know it or not. And how do we handle that now? And how do we, you know, that is something that I think would be an interesting question to wrestle with from a preservation angle. It's like, what does that mean for us now? But so it comes up in variety of parks, and in a couple of entries about suburban San Jose as well, where the Googleplex and others are located.
All right, I think I have one more question, and this will probably wrap it up. It's from Catherine Z, and it's really about who's telling whose stories. So she's wondering how did you assign who would write about what, and were there concerns about some people writing about other people's history? Because there are projects where this is a sensitive concern.
It's a really good question. I mean, so, you know, when we began the book, I think that evolved over time for us. But in terms of, you know, Alex and I wrote the majority of the book. And so we definitely were in the role of telling other people's stories. That was, you know, so this wasn't a book that was primarily about finding people from the communities where the stories are about. That would be an amazing project to do. I would love to be a part of and see that project. But this was a project where we were trying to use as sensitively and critically and carefully as possible our long experience of studying California and the Bay Area to try to sort of draw out the stories for the most part, that we think are undertold. There's some stories in the book that you will recognize if you are a student of California, but we might tell them in a slightly different way. And then in terms of the contributors, these are mostly people who are scholars or community scholars of the things that they are writing about. Sometimes they are from the communities that they're writing about. I'm thinking about some of Deanna Green's entries especially, and sometimes they're not, but they're writing about, you know, movements that they've been close to, have studied closely. And I mean, I think the answer to that question, the question I hear in there of, you know, who has the right to tell anyone's story, it's a really, really important one. And we held it up constantly, and we hope that we engaged with it well, you know, but we certainly aren't representative of all of the communities that we wrote about. And part of that is because we wanted to make sure we wrote about the wide variety of people and places in the region. So we're trying to be kind of representative in the book of lots of different struggles to show some of those connections. And so that's how we did it. That's how we took that approach. I'd love to hear about your project sometime, to the person who asked that question.
And you know, I will just very briefly add, I mean, I think if you read the sort of the acknowledgements and introductions, we're very transparent about who we are and our approach to sort of taking on a project like this. We had some really wonderful editors, and the series editors provided some really, I think, critical feedback in early drafts of the book about who was included, what sort of language was used. So those kinds of things, like it's a constant conversation. But it's, you know, I think it's true even when people are sort of writing their own stories, that there's always those complications about sort of who remembers what and how things are remembered. And I talked very briefly about China Camp, and it's a really interesting site to sort of talk about. We've got this really wonderful sidebar in the book about sort of contemporary artists using it to have conversations about racism and anti-immigrant sentiments. But also there's like a complicated history about the role of like Chinese capital in the sort of environmental struggles in the Bay Area, right? So there's like these stories get really complicated really fast. So part of what Rachel and I think have really tried to do throughout the book is pay very careful attention to the nuances of the stories, but also always at any given moment say, this is not the only story here. This is not the definitive story. There are infinite ways of thinking and looking at this, but what we can do is connect the ones we have here to try to give people a different sense of how the Bay Area came to be what it is today and where we might want it to go going forward.
Thank you both. I'll mention one thing, and maybe Chris will give you more information on that. CPF has a new fund to help spur the nomination of sites associated with underrepresented groups in California. So I thought it would be an appropriate time to mention that, and that if you would like to donate to this fund, we would like you to remember to text to donate 50155, the word preserve. So if you text preserve to 50155, everything donated today will be matched with that fund. And also, I'm going to paste into the chat box a link to the evaluation for today's program. We would love to hear your thoughts and also what you would like to see in future programs. Much of what we do is a suggestion from our audience and participants, and we really want you to let us know what we're missing in terms of content and topics. And finally, also just a reminder that you can find the book at the link that Rachel pasted into the chat box, or you can find it at one of the many local bookstores in the Bay Area. And is there anything else the two of you wanted to mention before closing out?
Yeah, do you have any social media? Like, where can people find you other than the book address? Alex, do you have a website we could share?
I don't at the moment. I'm
You gotta get one up because you're gonna have a lot of fans.
Cobbler's kids not having any shoes. I teach people how to build websites all day, but I've taken mine down for the moment. No, I'm on Twitter, as is Rachel, which is probably the best place to sort of keep up with some of what we've been doing.
Great, under your names, so we can find you on Twitter under your names.
Yeah, and I can.
So okay, wonderful. And yeah, and Rachel, I'm pretty sure I know that Catherine Z who wrote in, and I'm pretty sure it's the Green Book project that she's working on. So I can connect you to if you're interested.
Great.
And then we had, let me see, some questions about our text to give. It's a new program. You text the word preserve to 50155. And also I wanted to just thank you both very much for sharing your expertise with us today. And to remind everybody that if you're welcome to donate if you enjoyed the program, just go to californiapreservation.org/donate, and we make it very easy for you. But we hope everyone will come back and join us for our December programs. We have a lot of fun things coming up. So thank you both.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and it's great to virtually meet you all out there. Hope
Yeah,
to see you in person sometime.
Great. I'm going to leave the room open for the people that would like to visit those links in the chat box, but everybody is welcome to close out their windows and leave now if they'd like, or you can hang around. It's up to you.
All right. Thanks, John. See you soon.
Thank
Bye.
you all.